Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our fourth National Broadview Online Reading Club. My name is Emma Prestwich, and I'm the digital editor at Broadview. Our editor and publisher, Jocelyn Bell, is away on holidays. Working behind the scenes to help me out tonight is Sharon Doran, who's Broadview's promotions manager. Thank you so much for taking an hour from your evening to be here with us. Because there's a number of us online tonight, please mute your audio for our session, or I may mute it for you. But please keep your chat function on. For those who don't know how, hover your cursor over the bottom of your screen and the chat button will appear. Or you might find something on the bottom of your screen that looks like a speech bubble, and you can just click on that. We'd love to know who you are and where you're from. So please say hello from your hometown in the chat space. If you're a member of a church or other faith community and would like to add that in, please do so. It's great for all of us to get to know one another a little bit better. This evening we have three writers from our September issue with us: Diane Strickland, Nora Loretto, and Sally Armstrong, who have graciously offered their time for this event. I'll introduce each of them in turn, and then each writer will speak about their story for about 5 minutes. Then we'll have about 10 or 11 minutes to ask questions before we move on to the next writer. I know that all of you want to hear questions and comments from each other and not just from me. In the surveys we've been sending out after these events, many of you have asked for more audience participation. So I strongly encourage you to ask your question. There are two ways to do that. You can type "I have a question" into the chat and I'll call on you. Then you can switch on your audio and ask, or you can just type your question into the chat and I can ask it for you. Okay. That's about it for instructions. We'll get started. So our first speaker is Diane Strickland. Ordained for 32 years, Diane provides trauma-informed care to complex human situations. She hit the ground running during the pandemic, offering 4 free YouTube videos to support people, regional workshops, and 2 videos on re-entry to gathered worship. As a trauma professional, she is writing a primer on trauma-informed ministry and just finished an introductory article on that. Diane's story, In the Midst of Disaster, is about her post-disaster support work in Fort McMurray, Alberta, after the 2016 wildfires, and in High River, Alberta, after the 2013 flood. Please join me in welcoming Diane.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be here, and thanks for the invitation. It has been 7 years since the floods that came to Calgary and High River, and it's been 4 years since the wildfires that came to Fort McMurray. And it has taken me a lot of time to figure out how I will be carrying those experiences of disaster support in those places in my own life, and to do the integration work and the theology, because that's what I do. And also, it's probably taken even more time to figure out how I can talk about them, because so much of the work is really personal and it's private. And people often say, "Tell me stories." Well, I can't tell you stories. That's not sort of what I can do. And I'm very grateful to my editor, Elaine Eggertson, who helped me kind of wrestle it all into some form where you could read it. Along the way, I learned an awful lot about human beings and about myself. One of the things that has stayed with me and didn't make it into the final version, so I thought maybe I'll share with you here, because it is something that I come back to again and again. And that's that while people can get their heads around the uneven hand of a disaster, they can somehow manage to cope with the reality that the fire takes 4 houses and skips over 1 and takes the rest of them. They struggle with the uneven hand of recovery. So survivors want good outcomes for everyone. They don't even like, if they have a good one, they don't want to talk about it because they're so conscious of how hard everyone else has been affected. But as the programs and the policies unfold and change, and people seem to have more influence than others, and maybe just more bad luck or more good luck, recovery is not an even-handed thing. And so it's like an aftershock to the whole system. They understand disasters not in their control, but they assume recovery will be, and it often isn't. So it's kind of hard for communities to absorb that reality as well as the disaster, because there are impacts that are relational and financial and physical and social and spiritual and psychological that come along with an uneven recovery. And sometimes it can be worse for people than the original disaster. So I think about that now, particularly because of what we're in together as a pandemic. And I think about what's going to come after. I think about our recovery programs now, how those will affect us later. And when I talked to Broadview about this article, it was about a year ago. So we had no idea that when it was going to be published, it would be 6 months in to another critical human event that was not geographically contained, like a disaster usually is, but global. And I'm not sure, when the article went out, I thought, well, how are they going to be reading it now when there's more common experience about at least some experience with being destabilized in your life, your plans shot, constrained. Some people have incurred some real losses, and there's no certainty yet of how we're going to get out of this together. And I wonder, with people reading this article through that lens now, I hope that they'll see at least two good things. And one is the affirmation of understanding just how much their support to those two disaster groups must have meant, because you have needed more yourselves. And also seeing clearly that people go through unbelievable things and go on to live good lives and live them with love and laughter and commitment. No one gets the same life back. Recovery doesn't look like that. It looks like they know the big pile of everything that they cannot change, that they've lost already, that they can't do anything about. They look at it and they choose, okay, I've looked at that long enough, and I may have to come back to it from time to time, but I need to live again, and I need to teach my children how to do that. I need to teach my partner how to do that. I need to help my community do that. And so whatever happens to us, it's humbling and inspiring and transforming for me to have seen people do that and come to a giant change in me, which is that I believe in people way more than I did. And I feel I've come closer to this notion how God believes in us that way. I saw people go on, and when I think about where we are, I know that we will too. So that's kind of my thoughts on this, and I'm looking forward to hearing some questions.
Thank you, Diane. Wanted to delve a little bit more into what you had said, the relation of this story to COVID-19. And as you mentioned, based on when it was written, couldn't have known that this would be relatable to this particular issue. How can ministers and congregations, how can they support each other and their congregants in the recovery from this situation?
Are you talking about how everybody can support everybody? I'm not quite clear.
Yeah, how ministry staff can support their congregations and how people in churches can support one another.
Well, the trauma-informed model that I would like to introduce, that'll be something to offer people who are ministry personnel, but certainly being able to lower expectations is really important for yourself, because you probably cannot deliver the goods the way you used to. And that can be extremely hard because we start out the day and we think we can, and then we fail. And if we continue to behave that way, it can dig a big hole. But it's also what we expect of other people. So if we see someone is under functioning and isn't measuring up to their level, you know, we have to lower the bar a bit because they can't. And we do not know what's going on for them. And that's, you know, I guess that would be the most important thing, is to lower expectations and to try to encourage each other as you go along.
One of the most powerful aspects of your piece that I found was that idea of the second disaster. And you spoke to that a little bit a few minutes ago, that it isn't the initial traumatic event, but the recovery from that event that causes as much strife. Do you have an idea of what the second disaster might be for many people who have dealt firsthand with COVID-19?
Well, dealt firsthand, I'm not sure what you mean, like treating it or getting it, or because that's going to be different for everyone, how that second disaster comes. It could be that what you plan to do with your life you can no longer do. When you plan to retire, you can't retire. What you plan to do in a career path is gone off, and the schooling has changed, and relationships that we don't understand. A lot of relationships are held together by the routine of normal life, and they often do not survive when that normalcy is gone. So are those things that happen to people. But also it's just the realization where they've worked really hard. I know in these disasters where they work really hard for a year, and I really believe that Canadians mostly have been working really hard at trying to manage this. And a year from like 6 more months, and if we cannot see that we know how we're going to get out of this yet, that's going to be like a moment of, where's my life going, and how will I raise my children? What is their future? Those kinds of things will unfold for people, I think.
A question from Michael McTavish for Diane.
Hi, Diane. Thanks very much for the piece. I was just wondering if you had any thoughts about how the impacts might differ from something that's so long, so sort of large and so drawn out a crisis like the current pandemic, compared to some of the other examples that you have, like fire or floods or tornadoes that are more discrete, both geographically and temporally. How sort of unique do you think the impacts of those might be, and how different are these sort of challenges to then deal with in terms of recovery?
Probably the most important one is that you can get away from a disaster area. You can leave it. And, you know, I would spend a week in Fort McMurray, and then I got to fly out. I would spend the day in High River, and then I would drive home to Calgary, where there was no flood stuff. You can't go anywhere and get away from this. And for people in those disaster zones, even they could occasionally get away. And there is no break. There's nowhere to go. And this is a factor where we, when we can't even go to church, that's I think why people had that frantic, we need to get back to church thing, because surely that will be okay. So that's the main difference. And the economic destruction of the pandemic, we don't really know what that is. And it's localized in a local disaster, and other parts of the country or the world support you when you're trying to put yourself together again. But here, everybody's in kind of the same spot, and we don't know how we will get out of this. Anything else?
From Mary, Leslie?
I'm not seeing a question. Am I supposed to see it somewhere?
Now, hold on. I'm actually talking to you. Okay.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
Diane, I really found your article so interesting, and I'm a counselor, and I've been doing over the last few years a lot of video counseling. So I've been pushed into service kind of big time, not full time, but big time with the pandemic. And I've seen the marriages that have gone down that were tenuous before, but don't survive this kind of steady stress. But the other thing that has struck me is close friends who are ministers who said, I can do this for 3 weeks, I can do this for 6 weeks, but this is too much. And I can imagine your work now has been with ministers more, or has it been with the public, or how have you fit into shifting from one type of disaster to this more nebulous one?
There is a lot of work with ministers, and I have to say that is my where my emotional engine is in this. It is to come alongside them, and sometimes I do that informally, sometimes it's a formal kind of thing. It is really a difficult time, and when I went to the 2 congregations that I worked out of, I went to they were congregations, but they were basically healthy. They were not disasters. They loved their ministers and respected them, and their ministers loved and respected their congregations. I had no idea that I was going to end up in such a great situation. So when we think of ministers who are not in those situations and congregations that aren't, that's where I get very anxious myself about how they will find their way. I think, well, the best possibilities that somehow they will begin to see this is a waste of time, the conflict or whatever it is they can't get through together. I hope that would maybe be something that would happen, but I am afraid that what you're saying is I just don't need to do this anymore. Life's too short, and I don't have it in me. We have an expression in ministry where, if you've been through a lot and you've had to go into difficult situations, and sometimes people come to you and say, we were thinking of you, would you go to this place? They have this terrible situation they've been trying to dig themselves out of, and the question is always, do I have another one of those in me? Mm-hmm. And that's the question I think you're talking about, is ministers are looking at, and because of everything they have been through already, whether it's in that congregation or 2 before that, they may no longer have it in them. So I worry about that. And thank you for the work you do. One of my first jobs wherever I go is to find my counselors that I can refer people to, because that's what I do as a field person, is find the counseling people that I can send people to and refer them to. So thank you for the work that you're doing.
I just want to comment that what really impressed me was your creativity. When you talked about singing in the choir with someone,
yeah,
that just spoke to me very loudly. So, and I also thought how ministers must welcome you when you come to pair up with them in their community and see their resources and help them with those days when they can't get out of bed or they can't keep going. So, I mean, I think I've never heard of this ministry before this article, but I can't imagine it's not very vital and going to be more vital.
Yes, and that's part of my my push in this, is to help encourage other clergy and lay leaders to start doing continuing ed with these kinds of courses that I have, but there are gobs of them in emergency management, in trauma care, in the education system, in the justice system, and you probably know about this yourself, where there's all kinds of different ways you can train in the areas of your interest, so that when stuff like this happens, it's not just me, banging on doors saying, hey, it's people who are already among us who can say, okay, I know what to do.
The other point of your talk that you've stressed is the lowering the expectations. And I felt that I wanted to do that for a couple of the close friends, almost like family to me, that are struggling. You know, they're high level functioners.
Yes.
And they need that person that says you can go down here for a time being. This is going to be okay.
Yes, I don't talk about self-care because most ministers hear that and it's just another thing they're going to fail at. So they don't want to talk about it even. What I talk about is we need to learn how to participate in God's love for us. We need to join in with that. And
Wow.
and that's that has changed my life. And when I ask people to do that, ministers think about it differently. They think, oh yeah, because if I don't, it's like I'm spitting at God's love. If I do not figure out how is God trying to love me here, and how can I celebrate that? And that's what everybody needs to learn how to do, because everybody's expectations have got to be lowered, and it's very hard to do that.
Yeah, it is.
Really, really hard.
Right.
So
Thank
thank
you.
you for that.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you for your thoughtful questions, and to Diane. We're going to move on to our next speaker, Nora Loretto, who is going to talk about another story that has connections to our current situation. Nora is a writer and activist based in Quebec City. Her forthcoming book, Take Back the Fight, Organizing Feminism in the Digital Age, comes out this October. Nora is the editor of the Canadian Association of Labour Media and writes regularly for Passage, The National Observer, and The Washington Post. Her column, A Fair Deal, argues that migrant workers are essential to our food system and that governments need to treat them far better than they do. Please join me in welcoming Nora.
Hi, everybody. It was really wonderful to catch the tail end of that last discussion. This morning, my children have gone back to school because I'm in Quebec. And this morning I came across the Dean of the Anglican Diocese in Quebec City, which is, of course, the diocese that covers like the rest of Quebec that is not Montreal. And he was saying to me that he's been doing online services for sometimes 3 people every week. And it has just been really difficult to figure out how to continue to do his work during the pandemic. And that's really the theme, I think, of the pandemic, is all of us are realizing that the stresses that we're normally under, that society places on us, or that our jobs place on us, or our families place on us, or whatever, become even worse because of the pandemic. And so that's the theme that I was focusing on when I was talking about the struggle that migrant workers face, of course, in Canada. And so, I was asked to write an article in, I think it was March, about the pandemic. And so you can imagine like the task, like what do you say in March as cases are exploding and we're seeing really horrible situations arising within long-term care across Canada. And I've done a lot of work on long-term care. I've tracked actually about 8,000 deaths in residential care in Canada, and you can see that work if you follow me on Twitter. My handle is NOLORE, Nolore. But I decided to write about migrant workers because at the time it was very clear that in the workplace there was going to be a crisis, and that crisis would be disproportionately felt by people who had more precarity within society. And so there was an article in La Presse, which is the newspaper out of Montreal, the daily newspaper out of Montreal, along with Le Devoir, by a columnist named Yves Boisvert. And he talked about this couple that had come to Canada through the Roxham Road crossing, which is a crossing in Quebec that borders on the United States. And refugees have been coming through Roxham Road since Justin Trudeau had been elected. And this couple, one of them was found himself working in a textiles factory. His wife was working in a food processing factory and a meat packing plant. And on the weekends, he was working as an orderly. And he's one of the victims that had died in Quebec because of the work that he had been doing as an orderly. And so here's this man who flees to Canada. He's Haitian. He left Haiti because of the earthquake. He finds work in Quebec, despite the racism, despite the xenophobia, despite all the political work that people have been doing to make refugees demonized in this province. And there he is on the front lines of fighting COVID. And just as this story had come out, we started to hear of migrant workers coming to Canada, as many of them do every year and have done for many, many years before that. And this question about, you know, skilled labor versus unskilled labor. And so I talked about this farm, Scottsdale Farm, in southwestern Ontario. I'm sure there's folks who are from around that part of the world. I'm from around that part of the world too, even though I live in Quebec City. I'm from Georgetown, Ontario. And the owner of these farms are saying, oh, you know, we'll pay good wages, minimum wages, more than minimum wage to get Canadians to do this work. And Canadians show up and they're like, oh, this isn't unskilled labor, this is skilled labor. And the Canadians that show up can't do the work. And so what emerges is this situation where we have migrant workers who are living, you know, many people to a single room in unsanitary conditions, in a situation that would eventually take the lives of 3 migrant farm workers in Canada, and create kind of these crises within who's picking our food. Are we able to pick enough food? How much of it's rotting in the fields? The story that I wrote talked about asparagus farms, because of course it was early spring, and asparagus that wasn't able to be harvested. And of course, Windsor, Essex, areas across southwestern Ontario, British Columbia, where there's lots of migrant farms, the Niagara region, these remain to be hotspots of COVID. And we still don't have a government response that is forcing their employers to take this seriously, paying them decent wages, and then also taking those health practices seriously to make sure that if someone's isolating, they can isolate. And I guess I'll just end on saying, you know, the first person who died was in a hotel room by himself in another country away from his family. And you can just imagine what those final moments would have been like, by himself, going through total hell, of course, with the health kind of things that happen when you get COVID, and likely being scared to death and being so far from his family. It's just so horrible. And so we see this human toll that COVID has taken. And yet we do not see decision makers or policymakers adequately responding to these crises, to not just say, we'll protect you during the crisis. We're not even doing that, but obviously to protect these workers in seasons to come.
Thank you. You mentioned some concrete policy changes that can happen to make the situation more equitable for migrant workers. What can Canadians practically do to make that happen?
Yeah, and so migrant workers are a group of people in Canada who have very, very large levels of precarity, right? We talk about precarious workers all the time, and that's often workers in the gig economy or workers who work on contract, like, you know, I'm a contract worker. But these folks have no citizenship rights. If they complain about the working conditions within their work environment, many of them are sanctioned. And some of you might remember of the van crash that happened in southwestern Ontario in 2011, where 11 of these workers died because the van that they were in was one of these vans that's just a little bit too big, and so it's a van that crashes really easily. Of the workers that survived that, I think that there were 3. One of them was deported as he was trying to receive healthcare. And so for those of us who have status and who have the ability to advocate on their behalf, we need to do that. We need to make sure that politicians, even though they know that these workers can't retaliate at the ballot box, for example, that we can retaliate on their behalf, and that we need to demand that there is clear paths to citizenship, that there are safe working conditions, that they're given housing conditions that are safe, that they're not bunked even 2 to a room. My goodness. I mean, if you're working 12 hours a day, don't you want your own space to go home to at night? And that they are paid adequately. And I think that is, there's a lot of other demands. The Migrant Workers Alliance, I really encourage you to check them out, because they have quite a lot of demands that you can write to your members of parliament about. But if you live in a community where there's a lot of migrant workers, and also involved in faith communities, I mean, a lot of the workers do participate in local faith communities, especially in the Catholic Church. So there are a lot of connections and a lot of groups that already exist that I encourage you to check out and try to get involved with if you live close by.
As the farming season starts to come to a close this fall, are there particular things that concern you about migrant worker situations?
Yeah, I mean, the farming season comes to a close in that we're at the harvest, which is the most important time for a lot of the things that we'll be eating right now. And certainly where I am in Quebec City, I mean, the corn right now is like perfect, and I'm missing my family's corn roast, which we've done for 150 years in between Thorndale and Dorchester, Ontario. And so, yeah, now is actually exactly the time where they continue to need that support. Many of the migrant workers will stay in Canada until, you know, well into the fall, right until October, November. And so just as it was important in June, I mean, I kind of picked a great topic. I say that it was hard to decide what was going to still be relevant in May, but this is a topic that will still be relevant. And as, you know, some of the workers start to leave Canada, we cannot forget that this is not an issue that then pops up again in April or pops again in May. We need to see those policy changes now. We need to see those policy changes, both the provincial and the federal government, because they both have a role to play in these issues. And most importantly, we need these workers to be seen as part of Canadian society, not as people who we rely on for cheap labor to get cheap vegetables and fruits, but actually people that live in our communities, people that we absolutely depend on as you know, neighbors, or as brothers and sisters, or as colleagues or comrades, whatever you want to say, that they are part of the fabric of Canadian society, and they deserve the rights that the rest of us have.
A question from Michael.
Hi, Nora.
Hi.
It seems to me our food system's not completely brand new in the last little while, and so I was sort of curious about what your thoughts are on the kind of historical precedent and trajectory then of migrant work in agriculture in Canada in particular. Is this something that we've been leveraging more increasingly over the last several decades, and has the regulatory environment been changing during that time as well?
Yeah, so I mean, my family's in agriculture. My family has a dairy farm still in southwestern Ontario, and certainly, yeah, a lot of us had that path to Canada, which was working the land. I mean, it was part of the way that Canada was colonized, right? And so how migrant work has evolved in Canada, you saw throughout the 1960s and the 1970s, this intense reliance on people from outside of Canada to come to Canada to manage our food system, to pick food for us, or whatever. And it wasn't just food systems. I mean, you also saw throughout the 1980s this intense reliance on women, especially Black women from the Caribbean and from the United States, to start doing care work, which then started to become Filipina women that, you know, to this day, I mean, in places across Canada, you can see the reliance on Filipino women to care for children and to do homework. And so, you know, throughout the 1990s, this got much, much worse as globalization, you know, really started to take root, and we saw the global labor market really be something where we can just draw on the cheapest workers regardless of where they are in the world, not just the cheapest workers within our own communities. And so this, of course, exacerbated the situation. And so, you know, I think it was, you know, it was April 1st, 2011, I might be wrong, 2011, 2012, where the federal government under Stephen Harper changed the temporary foreign worker program. And what we saw was this incredible mass deportation, which got very little news, but it was actually the largest mass deportation that happened in like 50 years in Canada, because the program was changed by the Conservatives to try and address the inequities, but because they're Conservatives, they just can't get inequity right? So they do the opposite of what they should, and people are just deported en masse. But you hear from the stories of migrant workers that, you know, these folks have been coming for a decade or 2 decades, right? And so yes, it has accelerated, it has become a more important part of our food management system. But COVID has really shown us that we also need local food systems. We need to have local experts working the land, working those fields, becoming, you know, really strong managers of these lands, because we cannot rely on international food chains in a pandemic, because, I mean, we're all going through this pandemic, right? It's the problem with globalization, is this globally integrated markets. Like, oh my God, what do you mean the pandemic is in China? It's in Malaysia, it's in Colombia. It's like, yeah, it's global, right? So yeah, so it has gotten worse, and it has not at all gotten better under Stephen Harper, under Justin Trudeau, the current Stephen Harper. Sorry.
The question from Douglas.
Yeah, yes. A technical question from, or a comment from your piece is, you know, they said 182 hectares died, the crop died. Actually, asparagus is a perennial. And so while sure, it was a total loss of income and from the not being able to cut it, but the plants would come up as they always do after you take a first cutting and regenerate themselves. So just, I mean, when I look 182 hectares died, that's very dramatic. So it's just the word died wasn't quite right for me.
Thank you. Yeah, it's sorry, when you're working with a 500-word piece, you pick the shortest word, right? But you're very, very, very important point. Yeah, this is not, and of course, even if it died, it of course nourished a lot of other beings as well.
Yeah, as a kid, I remember playing hide and seek in the asparagus plants after it was picked because they'd all grow up into these huge bushes of stuff, and we could play hide and seek in the garden.
Wow.
Anyway, but on the issue of the farm workers, like your column pieces are so relevant, but it's a very complex topic. Is farm labor, farm workers, and so there's this kind of special area called migrant farm workers, and we've been doing that for decades, as you say, everything from picking tobacco in the old days, and I'm from Alberta, so you know they came up here to hoe sugar beets and things like that, and but it's not only the government that must be more supportive and respectful of farm workers, it's the employers, and that's tarring everybody with too much of a same brush, but you know the farm employers, yes, everybody you know has a big job to operate farms and the risks involved and stuff, but I've worked in farm agriculture, human resources for a long career, and there's a lot of issues about in employers who treat their farm workers with all those. I mean, you could just take the migrant out of your article, and it would relate to a lot of farm workers, no matter where. And again, in Alberta, you know, with the current Alberta government we got with Jason Kenney, who, you know, I mean, they found a willing pressure point, but you know, the rural community was just adamant that they retract a whole bunch of recent labor standard laws, which dealt with WCB and minimum wage and child labor and health and safety and the right to associate. Those are all, and they, you know, within it's one of those things. If I get into power, the first day I'm going to do this, and they did, and so they turned the clock back from the previous governments, you know, who took farm workers, who, I mean, so many pieces of legislation were always said this didn't apply to agriculture enterprises and stuff. And so they, you know, the previous governments just took that away. You know, like treat workers as regular citizens like anyone else, and they just would want to bring a broad brush. But so I mean, are you aware of all these other issues in farm employment than just the migrant workers?
Yeah, no, of course. And really, if you look at the infection rate within Windsor, Essex, which is where the 3 workers have died, 2 workers have died. The other one, I think, was held in Norfolk in southwestern Ontario. The infection rate across all agricultural workers was quite high. And, you know, you're talking about legislation that Rachel Notley had put forward in the Alberta NDP, and people might not be remembering this, but one of the pieces of legislation, you mentioned child labor, I mean, was the result of, what was it, 3 children who died on a farm by drowning, I guess, being suffocated under, I forget what the feed was, but canola? Grain. Yeah. And so these 3 children died. And so there was, you know, an outcry to say, do something. And this was one of the first things that the Notley government did when she was in her mandate. I mean, as I said, I come from a family that has been farming in this country for many, many years. And I never lived on the farm. And I mean, I'm quite far away from that. My mother left it, but she was the queen of the furrow. I have to say that for Ontario, for the Ontario Plow Match. My cousin was as well. And so, like, this is really an important place where we talk about capitalism, right? Farming is one of, like, there's a reason why we talk about collectivism and cooperativeness in farming. In fact, I started my first book on unions talking about how my grandmother would prepare the meals. Like, there was one combine in the neighborhood, and on the road, and the families would share the one combine, and my grandmother and all the other wives would have to make a meal for all of the men who would combine together to use the one machine that they had. And the way she told me the story, because she's a diehard, I mean, I shouldn't say this, she was probably a progressive conservative. My grandfather was a diehard progressive conservative. It's possible she voted liberal. Okay. But she would laugh about how the weather was bad and they couldn't combine, or they couldn't thrash, and she would have a meal for 10 men that she'd have to throw out because it was the 1940s. And so, like, these are the roots of the progressive conservative spirit in Canada, where we help each other out and we understand that farming is unpredictable and is dangerous and it sucks. It's like, it's one of those things that you need the state to help collectivize. There's a reason why we talk about collective farming. But because of collectivism, you also can see how it makes a lot of sense to use the purest form of capitalism in these situations, the lowest paid wages, the least amount of worker protections and supports. And my cousin who bought the dairy farm from my uncle, he did what? He looked at dairy and said, unless the barn burns down, or unless the federal government's going to be $1 million to refit my barn, because the barn was built in 1864, this is not a viable life anymore because of free trade agreements that are basically selling out my ability to do dairy within the supply management system in Ontario and Quebec. And so, we have to, if we're progressive people, and if we look at how we manage the land in this country, it's again tied to colonialism. And if we look at farming the way that we look at oil, the way that we look at mining, where you extract as much as you can, you don't care about the soil or the quality of the soil, you don't care about the quality of maintaining this land so that we can continue to let us nourish us for generations, then of course you're going to ravage it. And of course you're going to ravage your employees. And so I really hope that if you're interested in farming and in agricultural, the systems that feed us, there are really great experiments happening. There are really great new farming kind of collectives that are popping up all across the country. But we do need to look at capitalism and the role that profit plays in all of this, and how the state absolutely has a role to play in mitigating the changes from year to year in your crop success or your crop failure.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you, Nora. And now we're going to move on to Sally Armstrong. Human rights activist, journalist, and award-winning author Sally Armstrong has covered stories about women and girls in zones of conflict all over the world. From Bosnia and Somalia to the Middle East, Rwanda, Congo, Afghanistan, South Sudan, and Iraq, her eyewitness reports have earned her awards, including the Gold Award from the National Magazine Awards Foundation and the Authors Award from the Foundation for the Advancement of Canadian Letters. She received the Amnesty International Canada Media Award in 2000, 2002, 2011, and again in 2017. She was the 2019 Massey Lecturer. The lectures and book are titled Power Shift, The Longest Revolution. She's the recipient of 10 honorary doctorate degrees and is an officer of the Order of Canada. Her story, Dead End, explores the reality faced by Indigenous Guatemalans who travel to the US to seek a better life and are sent back. Over to you, Sally.
Well, thank you, Emma. And I can tell you there's nothing I like better than a backstory. I once had a television program called The Backstory. Backstories allow us to look at the behind the scenes and the twists and the turns that happen when we're trying to weave a story together. And invariably, they tell a very rich tale. I would say that journalists the world over love telling backstories, probably better than anything else they talk about. So when it comes to Dead End, I can say that just like everybody else, as I was watching those migrants coming from Central America and trying to sneak across the US border to find a better life in the US, my heart went out to them. It squeezed my heart. And when I saw those children being rounded up and put in detention centers and treated rather badly, I thought that too was heartbreaking. But you know what? It wasn't my story. I'm a journalist. I work in zones of conflict, and my beat is to find out what happens to women and girls in these places. So I didn't feel that this terrible story, which we were all watching, was really a story for me. But then the President of the United States, Donald Trump, started rounding up those little kids that he'd kept in detention centers and sending them back to Guatemala, back to the hunger and the violence that they were running away from. And when I saw that, I thought, yeah, this is my story. I wanted to know how did they get into the US? How did they cross that border? How did they get caught? I wanted to know what really happened in those detention centers. And I wanted to know, when you get turned back and you have to go home all by yourself, talk about a busted dream. That's the story that I wanted. So that's the story that I pitched to Broadview magazine. Now, at that point, I thought probably all I really needed was to find some people to interview who'd be willing to talk to me, to tell me what happened to them. But you know what? In the preparation for the story, I needed data. I needed a source. And I had been the guest speaker in Ottawa at an international humanitarian workers event. They were all there, CARE and UNICEF and Médecins Sans Frontières and World Vision, they were all there. And in the reception afterwards, I was speaking to Danny Glenwright. Now, he's the executive director of Action Against Hunger. And he began to tell me what they were doing, his organization, in Guatemala about the disasters that are facing these people. Because remember, I think most of us thought these people were running away simply to get a better life. Well, now I had a source, and I had someone who could help me with logistics. I had someone who could introduce me to the people I needed to know. So I felt pretty good. I thought, I had the story that I needed to tell. Well, that was only the beginning. Once I got there, I discovered there were two pieces of this story that I hadn't considered before. And they were two terrifically important pieces. As much as Donald Trump and his rhetoric had painted these people as rapists, as thieves, as drug dealers, and as much as he was really supposed to be the angle of my story, I knew the other pieces had to be told. And believe me, as a journalist on assignment, when your editor sent you there to get one story and you suddenly feel you've got to tell another one, this is anxiety producing. But the other two pieces of the story were, as I discovered it, first of all, it put climate change into sharp relief, but in a way that was poignant and it was educating. But you know what? The other thing was, when you hear about these stories, we tend to hear about these people and they're all faceless and nameless. And in this case, it was faceless and nameless runaways called the migrants. And I wanted to know who they were. I wanted to know the story of that little girl or that woman. And those angles became terrifically important to me, because there I was really on the rooftop of Latin America and finding out that who these runaways are, they're the Mayan people. That's the oldest civilization on this side of the water. And were they were running away not just to have a better life, of course, that would be a good reason. They were running away because they could not sustain the life they had there, the life they've been living as Mayans for 10,000 years. They've been growing maize all those years, all the way up at the top of those mountains. And now, because the dry season had lengthened so much, they just couldn't grow enough to keep themselves alive. And that's why they were running away. So it was heartbreaking. I was a witness to practically the demise of the Mayan people. And I felt that it was incredibly important that story get involved. I get told in my story not to let Donald Trump off the hook. I mean, his rhetoric was so repulsive about these people, but I needed to get up there and find out what was going on. And you know, the whole place just knocked me out. It is on the one hand raw, and on the other hand, pastoral. It is so beautiful that it did knock me out. Actually, photographer Peter Bragg and I were almost knocked out by the altitude. It's at 9,000 feet. We found ourselves gasping for air as we climbed up the hills to the villagers' homes. But you know, while I was there, it reminded me of how much I love the work that I do, because I get to put my feet in their shoes. I get to stand with them. I get to ask the questions you would have asked of them. I get to get the backstory and the front story. And it's an enormous privilege, because there I was, an eyewitness to what could be the demise of the Mayan people. But the last part of this story is this: the quickest way to the finish line for me would be to allow Donald Trump to continue to be the villain in this story. But if I did that, I would be shortchanging the reader, because I wouldn't be telling the whole story. And we'd be missing that terrifically important point that they were not just running away for a better life, they were running away from a life that could not sustain them. So my concern as a backstory was, how was I going to create a tapestry that could weave together the threads of these gentle Mayan people and this rough American president who didn't give a darn about them. And I hope I did weave it together, and I hope that's the story that came out for your readers.
Absolutely. To take it back to politics, unfortunately, do you think that if Donald Trump does not win this presidential election this fall, that any of the administration's policies involving migrants and family separations could be overturned?
You know, we can do anything. We have skills, we have experience, we have history. We as people can do anything. And as my story tried to explain near the end of the story, what the world needs to do is help the Mayan people to stay where they are. They cannot manage on growing maize. But you know, especially Canadians, we know so many ways to help with agriculture. We know the most modern ways to farm. We can help. And indeed, the Canadian government, I understand, is contributing. But we can reverse this dash to the United States by simply making life sustainable where they are. And I think for migrant workers, now I'm not saying we shouldn't use migrant workers. I think actually it's a very good system in many places and at many times. But the best thing I think we can do as humans is help people to stay where they want to live. And there's no reason not to do that. It comes down to politics, it comes down to hardly even finances. We know what to do and we know how to do it.
Mary Leslie says, Sally, you did an amazing job of wearing that tapestry. Loved the article and made it personal. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much.
Your focus is telling the stories of women and girls around the world. What inspires you and keeps you going as you do that?
Well, for one thing, because women and girls are winning as we tell their stories and people have more data. You know, the biggest shock I got in telling the Massey or writing the Massey lecture was to find out that from the very, very beginning, all the way back to the Pleistocene, to the Paleolithic, to the Stone Age, we never had a woman's story. Those early anthropologists and archaeologists were all men, and they went and did their research carefully and well, but they only did it on men, as though women didn't exist. So we've had a flawed history forever, and that has created the inequality, which is costing a fortune. I mean, if we get rid of the inequality, every single study done says your village will prosper, you will be healthier, and you'll be happier. Who can argue with that? So why do I continue to do it? Because I think those stories, well, I love to do it. That's the biggest reason. But those stories need to be told. And I think our readers, the readers that I reach out to, take action on those stories. And I think it benefits all of us.
Webster wonders, Sally, what is Action Against Hunger doing to help the Mayan people?
Well, it's detailed in the story, but as I said, they have to find a way to make life sustainable for the Mayan people where they are. So there are alternate means of farming. There's alternate ways of dealing with the earth that they have, the topsoil that they have. And Action Against Hunger is bringing that know-how to the people. But there are other issues, and we cannot ignore these issues. You have to be able to gently move people along to the way you handle nourishment, because if you don't, you may have enough to eat that you're not actually hungry, but it's not nourishing your body the way it needs to. There's way too much stunted growth among the Mayan people, and now there's an issue with cognitive impairment. So we can bring, I shouldn't say we, I'm only the scribbler here, but Action Against Hunger can, first of all, bring nourishing food to the people. Secondly, they can bring know-how on how to farm and exist where they are. But another thing that they told me that I was quite interested in, and I think, again, by telling these stories, we spread information. They need to alter the trade arrangements they have. Apparently, and I think we know it's true, we get cheap goods from the South, and we kind of think that's a great deal for us. Well, it's not such a great deal for them. So if we were to consider them in these great trade negotiations we have, the people there told me they need to be vastly altered. And I can say one more thing, that the government in Guatemala needs to be much more aware of their Indigenous people, as I dare say governments everywhere need to be more aware of Indigenous people.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sally, and to everyone for your thoughtful questions. That brings us to the end of our program. Thank you to all of you for being here tonight, and thank you especially to Diane, Nora, and Sally, who volunteered their time to make this event possible. We're very grateful to you. Tomorrow, we're going to send a short survey by email so you can share your thoughts with us about the event. Broadview's online reading club is a free event, and the costs to produce it are minimal. But if you'd like to help us continue to hire wonderful writers and journalists like Diane, Nora, and Sally, please consider making a small donation of $5 or $10 to our Friends Fund. You can go to broadview.org/donate. There will be a donations link attached to tomorrow's survey for your convenience as well. Broadview reading clubs exist across Canada. If you're interested in joining a local club or starting one of your own, please check out our information pages at broadview.org/reading-clubs. After this event is over, I invite those who are interested to remain on the call for an informal discussion time, kind of like a coffee hour after church. I know there was a comment or two that we didn't have a chance to get to. Otherwise, thank you so much for being here. Be well, and hope to see you back here for our next online reading club, when we'll discuss our October issue. Good night, everyone. So I know there was a comment that we didn't have a chance to get to from Judy.
Yes.
You still here?
Yes.
Very welcome to chat if you'd like to.
Okay. I just wanted to say that regarding the migrant worker situation, my partner and I just came back from Five Oaks, and you just did an article on Five Oaks recently. Did you not?
We did, yes.
Yeah. Where they are using that facility to allow migrant workers to isolate when they arrive in the country, and they're also now